In March 1893, the first thaw came down out of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains 3 days before the bank's collector rode into Cottonwood Bend with a stack of foreclosure notices tied under his saddlebag. The creek behind the Merrick homestead ran gray with snowmelt that morning. Joseph Merrick stood on the porch with a chipped tin cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the ridgeline. Watching the way the crows lifted off the aspen tops all at once and cut hard toward the south. Something about the sky did not sit right with him. He had learned long ago that a valley could feel a change before a man could name it, and Cottonwood Bend that morning felt like a room with the door quietly closing. Inside the cabin, Laura was already awake, kneading bread against the pine board her father had built into the wall the year they married. Their oldest, Nell, 12 years old and thin as a fence rail, was buttoning the sleeves of her brother's shirt because Sam, only 7, could not yet manage the small horn buttons himself. The youngest, Ruth, still slept in the box crib beside the stove. 4 lives, 1 roof, 160 acres of land Joseph's father had broken with a mule and a walking plow in the year the war ended. The Merricks had never missed a payment to the Denver and Rio Grande Land and Loan Company. Not one. Not in 18 years. That did not matter anymore. Joseph had known it did not matter since the letter came in January. Folded twice inside an envelope stamped with a locomotive in red ink. The railroad wanted the valley. The bank served the railroad. And the collector, a lean man named Raymond Kyle, had already emptied 3 homesteads on the north branch of the creek by the time the ground froze. The Petersons had been loaded onto a charity wagon in the snow. The widow Halloran had walked out with her 2 boys, carrying nothing but a Bible and a copper kettle. Joseph had watched from his own porch as her lantern moved down the wagon road at midnight and then went dark forever. He set the cup down on the porch rail and went inside. Laura looked up from the bread. She did not ask what he had seen. She had been married to him long enough to read his face the way he read the sky. He crossed to the kitchen shelf and took down the leather pouch where he kept the payment ledgers, then the smaller pouch beside it where he kept the deed his father had signed with a shaking hand in 1875. He laid both on the table between them. "Raymond Kyle is coming," he said quietly. "Maybe today. Maybe tomorrow. The lock on this door will not be ours by the end of the week." Laura did not cry. She had cried in January, once at night, with her face pressed into the wool of his shoulder, and she had not cried since. She only asked, "Where do we go?" Joseph did not answer at first. He was looking past her, past the window, past the barn, toward the high wall of dark rock 2 miles west where the creek turned and disappeared into a curtain of falling water. He had trapped that ridge as a young man. He had sheltered behind that waterfall for 3 nights during a spring blizzard in 1881, and he remembered every step of the passage behind it. He remembered the dry stone. He remembered the strange faint warmth rising from a fissure in the back wall, as if the mountain itself were breathing. He remembered thinking even then that a man could live in a place like that if he had to. That night the wind changed and came down out of the north with a hard, clean edge to it, and Joseph knew the last of the winter was reaching for one final breath. He waited until the children were asleep. Then he sat with Laura at the kitchen table by the light of a single tallow candle and told her exactly what he remembered about the place behind the falls. He drew it on the back of a feed store receipt with a pencil stub: the passage, the low ceiling for the first 10 feet, the widening beyond it, the fissure in the back wall where warm air rose steady as a man's breathing. He drew the ledge of dry stone where a fire could be built and the narrow crack overhead where smoke would pull upward and scatter through the rock before it ever reached daylight. Laura studied the drawing without speaking. Then she stood and walked to the crib and looked down at Ruth for a long time. The baby was 14 months old. She had learned to walk in November. Laura came back to the table and placed both hands flat on the wood. "How long?" she asked. "Until the ground gives us back the road," Joseph said. "Maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8. Long enough for me to figure the rest of it." He did not tell her yet about the other thing he had been thinking. He did not tell her that every foreclosure notice nailed to every door in the valley, had been signed by Raymond K.L. himself, and that Joseph had ridden past 3 of those doors in February and read the papers carefully, and that something about the wording had bothered him ever since. He kept that piece back. A man does not hand his wife every worry at once. He hands her the one she can carry that night. They began the next morning while the frost still held the ground firm. Joseph loaded the wagon in short, careful trips so no neighbor riding past would notice a household in motion. Flour in the burlap sacks, salt pork wrapped in oil paper, the cast iron skillet, 2 wool blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed, and 2 more from the children's room, a coil of new rope, the whetstone, the good axe, and the smaller hatchet, his father's rifle, and the box of cartridges kept dry inside a tin biscuit box, Laura's sewing kit, the tin cup Nell had used since she was 3, a small crate of potatoes still firm from the root cellar, onions, dried apples in a cloth bag, lamp oil, matches sealed inside wax. He made 3 trips to the falls that day, each one a slow 2 miles on foot through the aspen, with the wagon left half a mile short of the ridge because the last stretch was too steep and too visible from the wagon road. He carried the loads on his own back across that final stretch, one after the other, until his shoulders shook and his knees would not lock straight. Laura stayed at the cabin with the children. If anyone came, she was to say Joseph had gone to Alamosa for supplies. She practiced the lie twice in front of the mirror and did not like her own face when she said it. By dusk, he had moved most of what mattered. He came back to the cabin with the sweat frozen inside his collar, and Laura had a kettle of stew on the stove, and the children eating quietly at the table as if it were any other evening. Sam looked up and asked where his father had been all day. Joseph sat down and took a spoon and ate a full bowl before he answered. "We are going on a trip tonight," he said. "A quiet one. Nobody is to know." They left the cabin at 2 hours past midnight, with the moon hidden behind a thin wall of cloud and the frost crunching softly beneath their boots. Joseph carried Ruth wrapped in a wool shawl against his chest. Laura walked behind him, with Sam holding one hand and a bundle of the last blankets pressed against her side with the other. Nell walked last, carrying the tin lantern with the shutter half closed so the light did not throw farther than a man's arm. Joseph had told her the rule twice before they left the porch. If she heard hoofbeats on the wagon road, she was to close the shutter completely and drop to the ground and count to 100 before she moved again. They took the long way to the falls, up through the aspen instead of along the creek, because the creek carried sound and a child's cough could travel half a mile down a frozen stream on a still night. Joseph had cut a rough trail through the trees during his 3 trips that day, breaking the worst of the deadfall with the hatchet, but even so the walk took nearly 2 hours. Sam grew tired before they were halfway. Laura crouched and lifted him onto her back without a word and kept walking. Nell said nothing about her own aching arms. Ruth slept the whole way against her father's coat, and Joseph could feel the small, warm weight of her breathing against his ribs, and it steadied him more than anything else that night. They came out of the aspen onto the flat shelf of stone above the falls, just as the first thin gray of morning began to touch the ridgeline. The sound of the water was louder than Laura had expected. It came up from below in a steady rolling hush that filled the whole clearing and swallowed the smaller sounds of the world. The wind in the pine tops, the creak of leather, the shifting of a child in her father's arms. Joseph led them along the shelf to the narrow cut in the rock where a man had to turn sideways to pass, and then down a series of stone steps that his boots remembered better than his eyes. The passage behind the falls was exactly as he had left it 12 years before. The first 10 feet were low enough that Laura had to bend at the waist. The stone was wet at the mouth from the constant spray, but only for the first few paces, and then it turned suddenly dry underfoot, and the air changed. It grew warmer. Not warm the way a stove is warm. Warmer the way a root cellar is warmer than the outside air in January, a difference a man's skin noticed before his mind did. The passage widened after another 20 feet into a chamber almost as long as the cabin they had left behind, and taller than a man could reach with his arms stretched full above his head. Joseph opened the lantern shutter all the way. The light climbed the walls. Nell drew in her breath. The stone was dark and shot through with pale veins that caught the flame and threw it back in small trembling glints. At the far end of the chamber, near the base of the back wall, a narrow fissure ran up into the rock, and from it came the faint, steady breath of warm air Joseph had remembered for 12 years. Laura set Sam down. She walked the length of the chamber slowly, one hand trailing along the wall. She reached the fissure and held her palm above it. She stood that way for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at her husband, and for the first time since the letter had come in January, her face was not tight around the eyes. "We can live here," she said. The first day inside the cavern passed in a kind of quiet that none of them had ever known before. The waterfall outside made a sound so constant and so full that after an hour the ears stopped hearing it the way a man stops hearing his own heartbeat. And beneath that steady curtain of noise, the family moved through the chamber as if they had stepped into a house made out of the mountain itself. Joseph unpacked the crates he had carried up the day before. Laura swept the dry stone floor with a bundle of pine boughs he cut for her from the shelf above the falls. Nell laid the blankets out along the warm wall near the fissure and folded them into 4 sleeping places, the largest for her parents, the middle 2 for herself and Sam, and the smallest close beside her mother's for Ruth. She did it without being told. She had understood somewhere between the cabin and the falls that she was old enough now to be counted among the ones who did the work instead of the ones who were carried. Joseph spent that first morning studying the chamber the way a builder studies a lot he intends to raise a house on. He walked the walls with the lantern held close and ran his fingers into every crack that ran upward toward daylight. He found 3. The fissure at the back, which pushed warm air up and out of the mountain and would take smoke with it if a fire were built directly beneath. A second crack near the mouth of the passage, thinner, angled sideways, which drew a slow, steady draft of cold, outside air inward along the floor. And a third, high on the eastern wall, which he could not reach but which showed a small, clean coin of gray sky at its top when he held the lantern away and let his eyes adjust. 3 vents. 1 for smoke, 1 for fresh air, 1 for light, if he could rig a small mirror later to catch and throw it downward. He explained it to Laura at midday while they ate cold biscuits and shared strips of dried apple. He drew the pattern of the vents on the floor with a piece of charcoal from the lantern's burned wick. "A fire built here," he said, tapping the stone at the base of the back fissure, would pull its smoke straight up and lose it inside the rock before it ever reached the ridge above. No column of gray to show a rider on the wagon road 2 miles away. No smell either, because the warm air rising through that fissure was strong enough to carry the smell of wood smoke up and out through crevices in the mountainside a 1/4 mile from where they slept. Laura listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. "The children will need to move. They will need to run. A cave is a small place for a boy of 7. There is more of it than this," Joseph said. "The chamber goes back farther. I did not walk the whole of it in 81. We will find room." That afternoon, he took the lantern and Nell, because Nell had asked to come, and because he had already begun to understand that his oldest daughter had a steadier hand with a light than he did, and together they walked into the back of the chamber past the fissure and found that the stone did not end there. A lower passage opened behind an outcrop of pale rock, wide enough for a man to walk upright, and it ran a good 40 feet before opening again into a second smaller chamber, cooler than the first, with a shelf of stone along one wall that was so cold to the touch it made Nell pull her hand back in surprise. A cold alcove. Exactly what Joseph had hoped for. He stood there a long moment with the lantern raised, letting the light travel across the shelf of cold stone, and he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the letter in January. A cold alcove meant food. A cold alcove meant meat that would not spoil, and butter that would keep its shape, and the last of the potatoes carried up from the root cellar staying firm well into the summer. A cold alcove meant they could live in this mountain not for 6 weeks, but for 6 months if the world outside required it of them. And standing there beside his daughter, with the lantern held between them, Joseph understood for the first time that he had not merely found a place to hide. He had found a place to wait. Nell reached out and touched the shelf again. "Why is it cold back here and warm up front?" "The mountain breathes," Joseph said. "Air comes in cold through the crack near the door and goes out warm through the fissure in the back. Everything between them sits in the middle of that breath. The front warms because the vent pulls the hot air past it. The back cools because the cold air settles down and stays where it is heaviest. It is the same reason a root cellar is cold. Cold air is heavy. It falls." She thought about that. "Did grandfather teach you that?" "My uncle," he said. "The one who trapped this ridge before I did." They walked back to the main chamber, and Joseph began that afternoon on the work that would occupy him for the next 11 days. He built the hearth first. He carried flat stones up from the shelf below the falls one at a time, wet with spray, and stacked them against the base of the back fissure into a low platform 2 hands high, so the fire would sit above the floor and the cold air moving along the ground could not steal from it. He mortared the stones with clay he dug from the bank of the creek at dusk, working with his hands numb and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he carried the clay back to the cavern in an old lard tin and pressed it between the stones until the hearth held together as one solid piece. That first night they lit a small fire on the finished hearth. Joseph knelt beside it with a candle and moved the flames slowly through the air above the flames to test the draft, the way his uncle had taught him to test the draft of a chimney 30 years before. The candle flame bent hard and true toward the fissure. The smoke from the fire followed. It rose straight up into the crack in the back wall and disappeared into the mountain without curling back down into the room. Laura watched from the blankets with Ruth asleep in her lap and Sam leaning against her shoulder. Nell sat cross-legged beside her father and watched the candle. "It works," she said quietly. "It works," Joseph answered. He let the fire burn for another hour and then killed it with dirt and ash and sat listening. Outside, the waterfall kept up its steady rolling sound. Inside, the chamber was warm now, warmer than the cabin had ever been in March. And the stone walls held that warmth the way a good iron stove holds warmth long after the last log has burned down to coals. Laura made up the beds. The children lay down. Ruth did not wake once when Joseph banked the last of the coals for the night. Sam mumbled something in his sleep about a horse. Nell whispered goodnight to her mother and closed her eyes. Joseph sat awake by the hearth a long while after that, listening to the water, listening to his family breathe, and thinking about Raymond Kyle. Raymond Kyle rode into the yard of the Merrick homestead 4 days later at 10 o'clock in the morning with a deputy behind him and a locksmith from Alamosa driving a small covered buggy. The frost had gone out of the ground overnight, and the wagon road ran soft under the horses. Kyle dismounted without hurry. He was a tall man, narrow through the shoulders, with a mustache trimmed close and a black wool coat that had cost more than most men in the valley made in a season. He walked up to the porch and knocked once on the door, and when nobody answered he knocked again, and then he took a folded paper from inside his coat and nailed it to the wood, with 3 small tacks he carried loose in his vest pocket. He tried the latch. It opened. He stepped inside and stood in the middle of the empty kitchen and looked slowly around the room. The stove was cold. The breadboard on the wall had been wiped clean. The crib beside the stove was gone. The wool blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed were gone. In the loft where the children had slept, only the straw ticking remained, folded neatly against the wall as if the family had intended to come back for it and simply not gotten around to the errand. Kyle stood there a long time. The deputy came in behind him and said something about the Merricks having likely lit out for Colorado Springs the way the Hendersons had done in February. Kyle did not answer. He walked to the kitchen table and ran one gloved finger along the wood. There was no dust. The table had been wiped down that morning or the night before. He walked to the stove and opened the firebox. The ashes were cold, but not old. 3 days at the most. He closed the firebox and stood with his hand resting on the iron. They did not go to Colorado Springs, he said. The deputy waited. A family that runs to a city takes the crib, Kyle said. They take the blankets because the boarding houses do not provide them. They take the skillet. They do not wipe the table clean on the morning they leave. They do not fold the straw ticking. They do not close the firebox door. He turned and looked at the deputy for the first time. Somebody wiped this table this morning. The deputy shifted his weight. Sir, that don't mean they are still in the valley. It means they left in a manner, Kyle said, that expected somebody to look. He walked out onto the porch and stood a long while looking at the ridgeline west of the property. The locksmith had already begun his work on the front door. Kyle watched a thin band of cloud move across the top of the far ridge and said nothing to either man for the rest of the hour they were on the property. Inside the cavern that same morning, 2 miles away and 400 feet higher than the porch where Raymond Kyle stood, Joseph Merrick was teaching his son to tie a snare. Sam sat cross-legged on the warm stone beside the hearth with a length of copper wire in his small hands, and Joseph knelt beside him and guided his fingers through the loop and the twist and the small, careful bend that would hold a rabbit's foot but let a fox pass through untouched. Laura was mending a tear in Nell's coat by the light of the fire. Nell was reading aloud, softly from the one book Joseph had thought to bring, a battered copy of the Odyssey that had been his father's. Ruth was asleep on the blankets, with one hand curled around her mother's ankle. None of them heard the horses on the wagon road below. The waterfall took care of that. It took care of every hoofbeat and every axle creak and every voice raised on the road below. And Joseph had known from the first day that the sound of the water was the most valuable thing the mountain gave them, more valuable even than the warm fissure or the cold alcove or the 3 vents that carried their smoke away. The water made them deaf to the world, which was a hard thing to accept, but it made the world deaf to them, which was worth the trade. He had rules for the deafness. He had worked them out in his head during the long walk up from the cabin that first night, and he had spoken them to Laura on the second morning while they built the hearth. One person left the cavern at a time, never 2. Never the children alone, not yet, not until the ground dried enough that a boot print would not follow a person home. Whoever went out went at first light or at dusk, when the shadows on the ridge were long and a moving figure looked like part of the rock. Nobody crossed open ground. Nobody used the same path twice in the same week. The lantern was never lit outside the passage behind the falls, not even shuttered, because a shuttered lantern still threw a coin of light on the underside of a man's chin, and a rider on the wagon road at night would see it a mile off. Joseph had gone out 4 times in those first 4 days. He had gone once to fetch the last of the salt pork from the wagon he had left half a mile short of the ridge, and once to bring down the last of the potatoes, and once to gather deadfall for the fire from a stand of lodgepole above the falls, and once, on the 4th night, to walk down through the aspen in the dark and stand at the edge of his own property and watch his cabin from the tree line. He had watched for nearly an hour. There had been no light in the windows. There had been fresh horse tracks in the mud of the yard, 3 sets, and a small pile of harness leavings by the porch step where a locksmith had set down his tools. The front door had a paper nailed to it and a new brass lock plate that caught the moonlight when the cloud thinned. Joseph had not gone closer. He had stood in the aspen and read the shape of what had happened to his house without needing to touch it. And then he had turned and walked back up through the trees to the falls. And Laura had been awake when he returned, sitting up against the warm wall with Ruth in her lap. And she had not asked him what he had seen. She had only looked at his face and known. On the 5th day, he began the other work. The work he had not yet told her about. He took a stub of pencil and the flyleaf torn out of the back of the Odyssey, and he sat by the hearth and wrote out, word for word from memory, the notice Raymond Kyle had nailed to the door of the Petersons' cabin in December. He had ridden past that door 3 times before the Petersons were loaded onto the wagon, and each time he had stopped and read the paper carefully, because a man raised by an uncle who kept ledgers learns young to read the paper before he trusts the word. He wrote it out now, every line, every phrase, every strange bit of wording that had bothered him in January. Then he wrote out the notice from the widow Halloran's door, then the one from the Hendersons' place, then a 4th from a homestead on the North Branch he had passed in February. He laid the 4 papers side by side on the stone floor. He read them together. His hand went cold on the pencil. Every one of the 4 notices had been signed by Raymond Cale as agent, and every one of them referenced a transfer of the original note from the seller who had carried the loan. Most often a small local outfit like Alamosa Mercantile or the Del Norte Cattlemen's Bank to the Denver and Rio Grande Land and Loan Company on a date given right there in the second paragraph. Joseph had noticed the dates in January and thought little of them at the time. He noticed them again now, all 4 together. And the thing that had bothered him at the edge of his mind for 2 months finally stepped into the light. The dates were wrong. The Peterson note had supposedly been transferred to the railroad's bank on the 11th of September of the previous year. Joseph knew for a plain fact that old Ned Peterson had ridden into Alamosa on the 15th of September to make his quarterly payment, in cash, to the Alamosa Mercantile, and had come home and told Joseph over a fence rail that the clerk had counted it out and stamped the ledger and given him a receipt. If the note had been transferred 4 days earlier, the Alamosa Mercantile had no business taking that payment. But they had taken it, because the note had still been theirs. The Holleran notice showed the same shape, a transfer date in October, and Joseph could remember without effort that the widow had complained at church in November about walking all the way into Del Norte to make her payment at the Cattlemen's Bank, because the Cattlemen's Bank was where the note lived, and the clerk there had greeted her by name and asked after her boys. A bank does not greet a customer by name on a note it no longer holds. The Henderson paper, the North Branch paper, all 4 told the same lie in the same handwriting, and the handwriting on the transfer clauses matched the handwriting of the signature at the bottom of every notice. Raymond Cale had written the transfers himself. He had written them into the foreclosure papers as if the transfers were established fact, and then he had signed as the agent enforcing the transfer, and no one in the valley had thought to ride down to Alamosa or Del Norte and ask the original lenders whether the notes had ever left their books at all. Joseph sat back on the stone. He looked at the 4 papers laid out on the floor of the cavern, and he understood, with a clarity that made his hands shake, what Raymond Cale was doing. The railroad wanted the valley. The railroad had told its bank to take the valley. The bank had sent Cale to do it. And Cale, somewhere along the way, had learned that it was faster to forge a transfer than to purchase a note, and faster still to collect a bounty on empty land than to pay for it. Whatever the Denver and Rio Grande Land and Loan Company thought was happening in Cottonwood Bend, it was not what was actually happening. Cale was running the valley for himself, in the bank's name, and he was riding out with a locksmith and a deputy and empty homesteads in his wake. And the true holders of the notes back in Alamosa and Del Norte and Santa Fe likely did not even know their customers had been evicted. He looked up. Laura was watching him from across the hearth. "You have found something," she said. He told her. He told her all of it, quietly, because the children were asleep, and he told her what it meant, which was that the paper nailed to their own front door 4 days ago was worth nothing at all. The Denver and Rio Grande did not own their note. The First State Bank of Alamosa still did, and Joseph had been paying them for 18 years. Laura sat very still. "Then we did not lose the house," she said. "No," Joseph said. "We did not. They did not walk out of the mountain that week or the next." Joseph knew better than to carry a truth of that size down the wagon road with nothing behind it but his own word. Because his own word had already been folded up and nailed to his front door and covered over with a new brass lock. He needed the papers themselves. He needed the 4 he had reconstructed from memory to become 40 or 100. And he needed each one to be copied, not from what he remembered, but from what was actually nailed to the door in question, in Cale's own hand, on the day Cale had put it there. So through the rest of March and into the wet, cold weeks of April, Joseph Merrick went down out of the falls at night and walked the valley. He walked to the Peterson place first, and the paper was still on the door, weathered but readable, and he copied it word for word by the light of a shuttered lantern set inside the empty cabin where its glow could not be seen from the road. He walked to the Halloran place. He walked to the Hendersons. He walked to homesteads he had never set foot on before, farms whose owners he knew only by name from the church roll. And on each door he found a paper signed by Raymond Kyle. And on each paper he found the same forged transfer clause written in the same careful hand. He copied 23 of them by the middle of April. He carried each copy back to the cavern folded inside his coat, and Laura sewed a canvas pouch for them and hung it from a peg driven into a crack in the wall above the hearth, where the warm, dry air kept the paper crisp and the ink from bleeding. Nell learned to help him check the copies against one another. She had a sharp eye for a word out of place, and twice she caught small errors he had made in the dim light and sent him back down the mountain to correct them. The children changed in those weeks. Sam grew quieter and steadier and stopped asking when they would go home, because he had begun to understand that they were home, at least for now, and a boy who understands a hard thing is a boy who stops complaining about it. Nell grew older in a way that could not be measured in months. Ruth learned 4 new words, one of them the word for the sound of the water, which she pronounced hushu, and which the family adopted as the name of the waterfall itself. They spoke of it as a person after that. Hushu is loud tonight. Hushu is quiet this morning. Hushu is keeping us. Raymond Kyle rode past the property twice in April. Joseph saw him both times from the ridge above the falls, a small black figure on a bay horse moving slowly along the wagon road, stopping now and again to look up at the ridgeline. The second time, Kyle dismounted at the turn where the road came closest to the base of the falls and stood there for nearly 20 minutes, hands on his hips, staring up at the water. Joseph watched from behind a stand of lodgepole 400 feet above and did not move. Kyle eventually mounted and rode on. He knew something. He did not know what. He had that hunter's sense a man develops when he has emptied enough houses to know the difference between one that has been left and one that has been hidden from. And he had begun to circle the Merrick land the way a coyote circles a burrow it cannot quite locate the mouth of. But he did not find them. Hushu kept them. The mountain kept them. And every night, Joseph went down and copied another paper from another door, and the canvas pouch above the hearth grew heavier week by week. By the 1st of May, he had 38. The thaw came hard in the second week of May, and with it came the county circuit judge on his spring ride through the southern valleys, a lean gray man named Ezekiel Comstock, who had heard cases in Alamosa and Del Norte for 22 years, and who was known in 3 counties for a temper that ran cold rather than hot when he caught a man lying under oath. Joseph had been waiting for him. He had ridden into Alamosa 2 nights before, quietly, on a borrowed mule from a neighbor who had asked no questions and been told none, and he had left a sealed letter for the judge at the desk of the Grand Hotel, where the judge always took his room. The letter asked for 1 hour of the judge's time on the morning of the 14th at the courthouse in Del Norte, and it was signed with Joseph's full name and the words of Cottonwood Bend, believed by some to be missing. On the morning of the 14th of May, Joseph Merrick walked out from behind the falls in a clean shirt Laura had pressed against a warm stone the night before, carrying the canvas pouch under one arm and his father's deed and 18 years of payment receipts from the First State Bank of Alamosa under the other. Laura walked beside him. Nell walked behind them holding Sam's hand, and Ruth rode on her father's hip with her small fingers tangled in his collar. They walked down through the aspen the same way they had come up in March, and where the trail met the wagon road they turned east and walked the 4 miles into Del Norte in the full clear light of morning. And every farmer and freight driver they passed on that road stopped his team and stared, and then, one by one, turned his wagon and followed them. Half the valley walked into Del Norte behind the Merricks that morning. Peterson and his sons, who had been living in a lean-to on his brother's land north of town. The widow Holleran, who had been working in the kitchen of a boarding house and had walked out the back door still in her apron when she saw who was passing on the street. The Hendersons, families whose names Joseph had copied off doors in the dark and had never met in daylight. They came into the courthouse yard behind him without a word spoken among them. And when Joseph climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy oak door of Judge Comstock's chamber, more than 40 people crowded in behind him. Raymond Kyle was sitting in the front row. He had ridden into Del Norte the day before on unrelated business and had heard, on the courthouse steps that morning, that a man from Cottonwood Bend was asking to see the judge. He had come to watch. He was still watching when Joseph laid the canvas pouch on the judge's desk and opened it, and he was still watching when the judge began to read. And when the judge lifted his eyes from the third paper and looked at Raymond Kyle across the room, Kyle's face went the color of old ash. The hearing took 11 days. The First State Bank of Alamosa sent its president in person. The Del Norte Cattlemen's Bank sent its head clerk with a wagon full of ledgers. Every transfer was proven false. Every foreclosure was voided from the bench. Raymond Kyle was arrested on the 6th day and taken to the territorial jail in Santa Fe, where he was later sentenced to 14 years for forgery and fraud against the mails. The Merricks walked back onto their own land on the 28th of May. The brass lock came off the door. The paper came off with it. Laura lit the stove that evening and baked bread against the pine board her father had built into the wall, and the whole valley came to eat. Husha kept singing behind them from 2 miles west, the way she always had. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves stories of quiet courage, and subscribe for more tales of ordinary people who outlasted the powers that came for them. Leave a comment below and tell us, would you have done what Joseph did? We read every one.